Hi, good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to our webinar today on how to achieve net zero emissions in line with voluntary standards. My name is Kathleen O'Regan, and I'm here with my colleague Ankush Shirsat, who's helping out in the background, and we are hosting today's webinar in collaboration with Sustainio. We are joined today by Rahul MP, Managing Director, and Fergal O'Brien, who's a Senior Sustainability Consultant. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording afterwards. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, so please input any questions you might have at any time during the webinar, and we'll hopefully be able to address them or answer them at the end. We are all seeing the devastating impacts of climate change, and recent reports show records are continuously being broken and not in a good way. So 2023 was the warmest year on record, with the average temperature rise for 2023 above 1.5 degrees, and Europe is the fastest warming continent in the world. So with our changing climate, with increased energy costs, and with changing regulations and changing stakeholder expectations, it is a strategic imperative for business to develop carbon reduction plans and to reduce emissions as much as possible and moving away from fossil fuels. The Climate Action Plan target for the enterprise sector is to reduce emissions by 35% by 2030. And Enterprise Ireland strongly encourages companies to be as ambitious as possible. We do have a range of supports to help companies, from training and consultancy supports to capital supports to RD&I. So today we're going to hear from Rahul with the support of Fergal, and Rahul is going to talk us through, how to achieve net zero emissions in line with voluntary standards. And he would help to demystify some of the jargon that's commonly used and explain what terms such as net zero and carbon neutral mean. So Sustainio are an independent Irish sustainability consultancy that helps businesses take practical and meaningful sustainability actions. Rahul has vast experience as an energy consultant and a trainer, and his work is primarily on carbon footprint measurement and reporting. So over the years, he has worked with many different types of businesses, from aircraft leasing companies to TV stations, to understand, measure, reduce their energy use and carbon footprint. Rahul was also a contributor to the International Organization for Standardization's Net Zero Guiding Principles, which was launched at COP27 in Egypt in 2023, and authored Board Bia's guidance document for the food and beverage manufacturing sector entitled Pathways to Net Zero. He is the current president of the Association of Energy Engineers Ireland, AEE chapter. So Fergal then is a senior sustainability consultant and has extensive experience in sustainability, media, and digital transformation. He has worked at many sustainability-focused organisations, including Brand Impact Agency, BBMG in New York, and the Ecology Foundation in Dublin. Fergal's focus at Sustainio is carbon accounting and advisory. He guides clients to share their sustainability strategies, set achievable targets, and create verifiable emissions reports for various reporting standards and frameworks. He holds a certificate in climate action from the Association of Energy Engineers and is also trained as a B Corp leader. So Rahul, I'm going to hand over to you now, and I'll stop sharing my screen, so I'll come in at the end for Q&A. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, and delighted to be here today. I'm just going to set up my screen, my side, just so I can see those that are presented there. Delighted to be here, and hopefully you can see my screen now. Is that coming through okay, Kathleen?
Yeah, no problem. You can see it.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much for that. So just to go through what we're going to do today, it's kind of broken into three main sections. We're going to cover carbon footprint calculations at a high level, because you've got to know your number first before you go about setting any targets. And then we'll get into the concept of science-based targets and net zero. Carbon removals also comes into it, so we got to talk about that too. We will address the topic of offsets, and it's often quite contentious, a little bit like Marmite. You either love them or hate them, but they likely will form part of the journey that we'll be on. So Kathleen gave us a very warm introduction there, and appreciate that. Of course, our focus, while we are a sustainability consultancy, we specialize in climate action, very much our bread and butter, and what we are really passionate about in our practice. We're all about quantifying sustainability through numbers and helping companies reduce the impact they have on the environment. So just to let you know, I mean, Kathleen mentioned that, we contributed to the ISO document, the net zero principles, and we'll give you links to that in today's presentation. But we also have a climate action certificate course, which we launched last year. It's been very successful. It's gone global, and that's with the Association of Energy Engineers. It's a 2-day course. And if you find today's webinar is just a bit too fast, we could have more time to get into the detail on how to do climate action planning, climate action road mapping, net zero, whatever you want to call it. We can help you with that in the course. So there's an online course next week. I'll be in person delivering it in Nashville because it's got quite popular with an American audience. That's at the World Energy Expo. And then we're in Dublin, which is probably the most convenient, in the middle of October. That's our next Irish course. Now, Fergal, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Thanks, Raoul. I'm Fergal O'Brien, Sustainability Consultant here at Sustaineo. I help our client organizations calculate their emissions and advise on how best to reduce their impact. And I'll be manning the poll questions and the Q&A today. So to kick off, we're going to ask you a quick question through our Slido poll. So if you could grab your phone, there are 2 ways to join Slido. You can scan the QR code you can see in the top left-hand corner, or open a browser, enter slido.com in the address bar, and where it says enter code here, you can enter the joining code number, which for today is 2328382. So once that is inputted, you'll see the first question, and we've already got one answer in. So the question for you is, what sector are you in? So hopefully an easy one. This is an anonymous poll, so please, if you could engage and let us know what sector you're coming from. There's 15 sectors outlined, and if your sector isn't listed, please click on other. So we've got everything from aluminium to apparel, aviation, buildings, chemicals, cement, etc.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, kind of what we'd expect, because I guess we're assuming that most of you are SMEs, and these are specialist topics that result in large emissions, and that's why the Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTi, has written several sectoral guidance documents. But interesting to see that some of them apply to you. So we've got buildings, the chemical industry, ICT, FLAG, which is forest, land and agriculture, and of course land transport. I don't think any of the others are popping up, but we've got a bit in steel as well, possibly. So that's all very good. Yeah, and we got 50 answers in there, Fergal. Is that good? I think we got 80 on the line today.
Yeah, so maybe a quorum. If we could try and get it up to 60, that would be great. But maybe 50 is it? I'm not sure if there's any more coming in. 51.
Yeah, and do understand we may have some consultants on the line too, and that's okay. Generally, when we'll get into SBTi in a moment, and there's the net zero standard, which looks like this. It's actually hot off the press. They've updated it in March of this year, and that can be kind of used for everyone. But if you're an SME, there's a streamlined process. If you're a financial institute, they have a separate standard for that. But generally, for most of us, we'll be following the SBTi corporate net zero standard. And then for those of you in the sectors there's additional guidance that you'll need to follow. Quite a lot of guidance documents and stuff to navigate. It is a complex space. Well, it's kind of plateaued there, Fergal, at 54. So I think in the interest of time, we'll keep it moving. But thanks for that, folks. And this is anonymous, so no one's names come up, and we will be sending the slides back to Enterprise Ireland with the results of today's poll. Okay, so let's get into carbon footprint calculations. There's some terms that we need to cover, but firstly, why would you do a carbon footprint? Why would you want to know your number? Well, firstly, it's about winning business for most of us. Knowing your number in conjunction with having a credible carbon reduction plan is now becoming a social license to do business, and effectively our buyers, our customers, are asking us what is our number. Secondly, it's about tracking progress. So organizations often ask me, you know, do you have any benchmarks for us or whatever? And the best benchmark is really tracking yourself against yourself, because when consultancies or businesses do their own carbon footprint, they're often forced to make assumptions or value judgments. And as long as those judgments are consistent year on year, you can make comparisons. But if you're comparing different organizations that have different activities, it's quite difficult to make meaningful comparisons. Now, there are rules that can allow that for products and things like that. But generally, I say the best benchmark is yourself. You're tracking your own progress over time. But if you do have a choice between two different business directions, you can do carbon footprints on both direction. And if they're calculated on a like-for-like basis, then that can provide a meaningful comparison. And the last reason you might want to do a carbon footprint is it is becoming a legal requirement for some. So I'm sure some of you have attended previous webinars on the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD. That's now mandating that certain organizations, generally large organizations, listed SMEs, must report on various sustainability criteria. And climate and energy comes under one. Let's have a look at that. They have these things called the ESRSs. They're the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and E1 is the first environmental standard. That's on climate and energy. And basically that standard on the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is asking businesses to understand you know, their climate impacts and the compatibility with limiting global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, that's a key temperature because that's the one that's written in the Paris Accord. That's what we all agreed to back in 2015 in the Paris Agreement. And in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was saying that you know, we really need to work towards 1.5 degrees centigrade, because it was a stretch target before that, with a sort of a main target of 2 degrees centigrade. But as the effects of climate change kick in, there's more focus on this. So these are a couple of screen grabs from this particular standard. You know, our sustainability statements should be looking at, you know, past and future mitigation efforts. That's how we're reducing our organization's emissions in line with the Paris Agreement and that temperature target. We've also got to articulate our transition plans. How are we going to reduce emissions? There's IRO management, that stands for impacts, risks, and opportunities. So you're meant to kind of effectively look at, they talk about double materiality. So we're looking at the impacts on our companies as well as our outward impacts onto society and the planet. And then there's a whole suite of metrics and targets that we've got to report on, including scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and, you know, our own targets for improvement on this space. So that standard isn't saying you have to do net zero or science-based targets, but it's kind of pointing in that direction, saying that you've got to understand your impacts and where you do lie on a scale. So let's do some simple definitions. The first is, well, what is a carbon footprint in the first place? And this definition comes from a great book called How Bad Are Bananas by Mike Berners-Lee, quite an entertaining paperback book. If you do get it, get the revised 2020 edition. And he says a carbon footprint is the best estimate that we can get of the full climate change impact of something. And carbon is shorthand for all the different global warming greenhouse gases. You know, there's 7 of them articulated by the Kyoto Protocol, but we call it a carbon footprint, but effectively we mean all the greenhouse gases. And footprint is a metaphor for the total impact that something has. And we can do a carbon footprint on an activity, an item or a product, a lifestyle, a company, a country, or even the whole world. So anything can effectively be translated into an emissions impact. Now we have these things called scopes, and they're really a hierarchy of greenhouse gases that also is there to protect us from double counting of emissions from different organizations. So scope 1 are the most important. There are direct emissions to the atmosphere. The EPA publishes a national inventory report, which is all the direct emissions of the country on an annual basis. And I guess if we could all eliminate our direct emissions to the atmosphere, climate change, global warming would be solved pretty quickly. But we do emit a lot. As a country, we're emitting about 60 million tons of CO2 equivalent on an annual basis, and there are Scope 1 direct emissions up to the sky and the atmosphere. Now, Scope 2 emissions is a classification for indirect emissions by purchased energy. And the I guess the direction here is you control the consumption of it, but maybe not how it's generated. So the main one under Scope 2 is our grid electricity use. We can control how many kilowatt hours we consume to some extent by switching things on and off, but we don't control how that's generated. That's more air grid calling for different sources of energy to balance the grid. And then Scope 3 is indirect emissions from everything else. So think of all the things that you buy, the goods, the services. It could even be investments. There's a whole breakdown of Scope 3 emissions. And generally, this is where it gets kind of difficult and we need the value judgments. So we find that our clients often know their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and they might want us to just check them for robustness on their calculations. But it's Scope 3 that they need the help on. Also, it's collating the data and then applying appropriate emissions factors to get a credible and robust carbon number. Now, there's a fourth scope that we sometimes use. This was coined by the UK government. They call it outside of scope emissions. And here we're accounting for carbon neutral, in quotation marks, bioenergy. So, of course, when we burn biomass, we're releasing CO2 chemically to the atmosphere. But if it's coming from a sustainably managed source, it's counted as carbon neutral because there's a virtuous cycle where, say, the forest is absorbing the same amount of CO2 as we emit when we burn the harvested products from that forest. So scopes are important and we need to understand them for the purpose of this. Now, I'm going to give an example here. This is my own family carbon footprint. You can see we've been tracking it over time and it goes up or down. The point is I'm not proud about any of the numbers in here, but I think it has an important learning value to that. You can do the same thing for a company, and this is about understanding it. Now, you might look at my carbon footprint and go, well, it's gone up higher. And, this is coming from a carbon consultant, but you need to understand the context and the story behind it. We made some progress back in 2016 by installing a solar thermal panel on the roof and switching to more fuel-efficient car. And then, the impacts of COVID really dampened our family emissions, reducing it by over a third, where, there was no flying and we didn't have the ability to move. And then we switched house. We went to a larger, older house, and because the house is 200 years old, our heating bill went up 5-fold. So that was a massive thing. And I know I've got my own challenges in terms of trying to decarbonize the house that we've moved into. And then the last one is, you see this dark green bar at the top of that stacked bar graph. That's our flying footprint. And last year we took a kind of trip of a lifetime to the US to travel Route 66. So the few hours in the plane, because we're a family of 4, it outweighs everything else, running the heating and the power in our home, or the 2 cars that we use to get to and from work and get the kids to school. And it's just to be conscious of these. So, I don't really believe on placing an onus of guilt on people and their personal family footprints. What we really need is systematic economy-wide change. And that's why the enterprise sector is really so important in this, that we kind of try and move collectively. And we have bought carbon offsets in various projects, from tree planting projects or protection of rainforest, and even safe water projects in Africa as well. So Fergal, I think you have a question just considering this carbon footprint and what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. So the second poll question is: Raoul's family impact carbon neutral, net zero, climate neutral, or is it something else? So 3 options there, or if you believe it's something else, please add to the Q&A so we can see your answer. And we use the same code throughout, so 2328382. And again, these are anonymous, so there's no visibility. Please take a guess if you don't know.
Okay, and I can see we got 85 on the line. So it'd be lovely to get over 60 if we can, folks. Yeah, take a guess if you don't know. It's just, where do you think it is? Okay, it's still moving. Now, we got 40 in there, which is maybe fairly okay, Fergal. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. And, by the time we get to the end of today's webinar, I hope the answer will be evident to you. But most of you are going for carbon neutral, with some people thinking it's something else, and some going for climate neutral and net zero. And I'm sure if we had a one-to-one conversation, we could talk it out. But this is for the purpose of just making you think. Of course, the topic is net zero today, so we need to understand what that means, as well as some of the other terms. Okay, so let's get into understanding science-based targets and the concept of net zero. And I will get into the standards and the various definitions in this section. There's kind of been an evolution of carbon reporting. If we go all the way back to the Kyoto Protocol, which was an international treaty ratified in 1997, that one called for industrialized nations to significantly reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the corporate world followed swiftly after that with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which was developed by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. That was published in 2001 and revised in 2004, and it's the most popular carbon footprinting standard, so you'll see that referenced a lot. And they're the guys who coined the terms scopes 1, 2, and 3. So ISO has a standard as well. It's got slightly different terminology, but effectively does the same thing. So if you like your ISO standards, you can read ISO 14064 Part 1. I guess the benefit of the ISO standards is they're written more tightly. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is kind of American standard, but it is used worldwide, and it's a lot more reading in it, but a lot more examples too. Now, the Carbon Disclosure Project has been around since 2000, and now it has about 23,000 organizations disclosing their environmental information on an annual basis. And this is really to empower investors. There's $142 trillion of assets in this group, and the CDP also publishes a leadership indices. So, companies like to be on the A list where they're demonstrating really good credentials in their climate reporting. Now, the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is going to be the focus of today, that sort of was an answer from the business industry, again, like following the Paris Agreement 2015. It was initiated by the Carbon Disclosure Project, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, or the World Resources Institute, the UN Global Compact, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So they're all behind it, and it's kind of evolved into its own entity now. They're talking about targets in line with what the science is telling us, that we need to keep global heating below catastrophic levels. So that's below the 1.5 degrees centigrade, and that we need to reach net zero by 2050 at the latest. So what the Science-Based Targeted Initiative has a validation service. So if you create a science-based target for your business, you send it into them, you'll pay a fee, and they will scrutinize it and validate it for you. But they're also developing a lot of standards and sector guidance, so they sort of have two functions that they've split out of that initiative. And the one we're going to focus on today is the net zero standard. This is their corporate net zero standard. It was first published, I think it was October 21, and now we're on a kind of second revision, or version 1.2, which was published only last March. And we have to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 90% or more sooner than 2050. And if we do have residual emissions, we've got to neutralize them. And I'll get more into that shortly. I think one key message is that carbon offset credits can't be counted in terms of achieving your long-term target. So who's doing it? Well, we got 112 Irish companies are currently listed on the website, and I've got given the link there. Sciencebasedtargets.org is the website. And 33 of these Irish companies have set net zero targets, which is deemed to be kind of the most onerous of it. Like, you can set a near-term science-based target, a long-term science-based target, and then you can encapsulate both in an overall net zero target. There are some other targets you can do as well, like renewable energy and supplier engagement targets, but we won't really get into them today in the interest of time. So there have been plenty of standards. You know, there's standards for carbon neutrality. I've got the Carbon Neutral Protocol, which is an American one. And then past 2050 or 2060 was a publicly available specification by the British Standards Institute for demonstrating carbon neutrality. That's only recently been replaced. We now have an ISO standard, which was in development for a long time, but it's ISO 14068 Part 1, and that came out last November, and that replaces that one. So there are your carbon neutral standards. And then we have net zero. So on the left-hand side, there's the Science-Based Target Initiative Corporate Net Zero Standard. That's the cover of the first version. And on the right-hand side, we have the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, which we contributed to along with other people throughout the world and a lot of experts. Very interesting to see how, you know, a guidance document like that would be developed. Interestingly, we got some quite significant amendments made. So it's amazing what, you know, one person commenting can do. For example, having carbon performance indicators, we got that taken out because effectively the key metric for all of this is getting our tons of CO2 equivalent down to as close to zero as possible. And if we start hiding behind carbon performance indicators like energy performance indicators, there could be a risk of greenwashing there. And we do see that in the energy industry, for example. So let's give you the definition as to the SBTi's definition from their standard. They say that the net zero is reducing your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions to zero or to a residual level consistent with reaching net zero emissions at the global or sectoral level in eligible 1.5 degrees centigrade aligned pathways. So we have to reduce a lot in line with the science. And if we do have residual emissions, we've got to permanently neutralize them at the net zero target year with removals from the atmosphere. So that's why I have a sort of weighing scale there. It's balancing up our emissions versus removals. And it also points out quite strongly that a company cannot claim to have reached net zero until, number one, the long-term science-based target for all 3 scopes has been achieved. And number two, the company has then neutralized the residual emissions. Now that is really ambitious, but we've got a graphic from the standard that I hope articulates it. I know this looks a little bit complicated, but bear with us as we go through this. The purple dashed line on this graph denotes a science-based target glide path. So you can see it's kind of going down quite steeply, close to zero over the long term. And the dark blue bars show the emissions of an imaginary company reducing over time in line with that target glide path. So we call that the organization's target boundary. You know, they have to decide what are they including in this. And broadly speaking, the science is telling us we've got to halve our emissions by 2030 and get to zero or very close to zero by 2050 at the latest. Now, step one of this graph is to set near-term science-based targets. And these are really over a 5 to 10 year time frame, and they're marked by the yellow milestone on the graph there as point 1. The second step involves setting long-term science-based targets. So this is, how are we going to reduce our emissions, in line with the 1.5 degrees centigrade scenario by no later than 2050. And generally, we're talking about a 90% plus reduction. So these are really tough reduction targets to hit. And then lastly, when we get there to our long-term science-based target, It's about neutralization of any residual emissions. If we have them, hopefully we can completely eliminate them, but it is kind of conjectured that it's likely some industries will have residual emissions, that we can balance them by carbon removals. And this is where we're removing carbon or other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And that's denoted on this graph by the purple bar on the negative axis. So you can see that's balancing the dark blue bar above it. So the net zero standard also acknowledges that some organizations have been purchasing, various verified carbon offsets. Sometimes these have been called compensation measures, or more recently, they're using the term beyond value chain mitigation. So, kind of heavy words here, but they do point out that any carbon credits that you might buy, they cannot be counted towards your science-based targets. So science-based targets are all about reduction. And if you do buy these carbon credits, you can optionally report them separately, but they do not count towards your science-based reduction pathway. Now, the removals are a bit different, because if you do have residual emissions when you get there, you're going to have to find a way to remove equivalent amounts of emissions out of the atmosphere. So let's just do a sort of quick comparison between carbon neutral and net zero, because, we all cast our vote there on, was my family carbon neutral or net zero? According to the standards, they actually mean very different things. So if we look at the standards for carbon neutrality, we could do it for a product, a service, or the entire organization. Generally, the standards will require us to address scope 1 and 2 emissions, but scope 3 emissions are not mandatory. And any of you that have got into the carbon footprinting game will understand that sometimes scope 3 emissions will be 70, 80, maybe even 90% of your total carbon footprint. So they are significant looking up and down your value chain. In terms of reductions required, well, the sort of carbon neutrality standards, they don't specify massive levels of reduction, and residual emissions, we can buy verified carbon offsets to claim carbon neutrality. Now let's have a look at net zero. How's this different? Well, firstly, it's about a whole organization. And one thing we voted on the development of the net zero guidelines was that you couldn't have net zero products, for example, because that would allow companies to greenwash. They could say one of our products is net zero, but maybe the other 90% of the products, they're not even doing anything with them. So it has to be the whole organization. Not only do we have to do scope 1 and 2 emissions, we have to do scope 3 emissions too, if they're significant, and generally they will be. In terms of reduction, to get in line with the 1.5 degrees centigrade science-based trajectory, we're talking about 90% reductions or more, and at least that, before we can start counting carbon removals. And in terms of residual emissions, it's verified carbon removals for residual emissions. And the key word there is removal. You can see in carbon neutrality, we can buy any verified carbon offsets, but with net zero, we've got to be drawing them down out of the atmosphere. So these two last requirements in particular are very onerous. And I hope that table sort of helps you understand the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero as we have for sort of corporate standards. So how are we going to set science-based targets? Well, it's a sort of 5-step approach. Firstly, we need to select a base year, and that's a point in time we're measuring progress against. We should take a representative year, and it must be no earlier than 2015. Some of you will use 2020, but maybe you want to go before the impacts of COVID. It could be 2019. And then once you've chosen that, you've got to calculate your emissions. So generally, we're pointed to the greenhouse gas protocol. There's a lot of guidance there for its corporate standard is the main one, but they have additional guidance on scope 2 emissions and scope 3 value chain emissions. And generally, when we're doing emissions, you've got to calculate at least 95% of your scope 1 and 2 emissions and a complete scope 3 inventory, including, at least 90% of your scope 3 impacts. And that can be hard to do. How do you measure something that hasn't been quantified before? And you need a plan to improve your data quality as well. So that's challenging enough. And then thirdly, you need to set target boundaries. So you've got to have over 95% of your scope 1 and 2 emissions included within your target. And if your scope 3 emissions is over 40% of the total, then you must include 2/3 of those scope 3 emissions in your near-term target, and ultimately over 90% of them in your long-term target. So there's a lot of percentages here, a lot of targets. I know it's kind of confusing, but we're just giving you the important parts of it. And then, you will have to refer to the particular guidance documents. There are other requirements too. So if you're in the flag sector, that's the forestry, land use and agriculture, then if they're over 20% of your emissions, so the land-based emissions, then you'll have targets for that as well. The fourth step is to choose a target year. So for your near-term target, it's within 5 to 10 years of the submission, and the long-term target should be by 2050 or sooner. Exceptions are power and maritime sectors. They've got to have a long-term target by 2040 that's been pulled forward for them. And the overarching net zero target will be the same as the long-term science-based target. And then the fifth step is to calculate your targets. And this is where you'll have to go to the SBTi website. They have tools and resources to help you do that. It does depend on the approach you choose and the sector you're in. And as well as all of that, just to remind you, carbon credits can be reported, but do not count towards your near or long-term target achievement. Avoided emissions do not count as a reduction. They're not the same thing. So you need to be aware of that. You should report biomass emissions, so burning biomass, CO2 emissions separately. And also, if you're involved in the sale, distribution and transmission of fossil fuels, you're meant to be reporting on those, because if you're in that sector, they can be massive. They should be reported as well. So a lot of requirements in there, and you kind of have to go into the standard and the guidance documents to get the detail of your particular sector. Now, sector guidance. Fergal gave you a great poll at the start, who's in what sector, and good to see that you didn't all select others. So some of these will apply to you. Some of these sectoral documents are still in development or only being scoped out, but you can go to the SBTi website and see how they reflect to you. But generally, if you decide to go down this route, you can all use the net zero corporate standard and the applicable sectoral guidance. The exceptions are as follows. So financial institutions have their own net zero standard and guidance on it. And if you're an SME, which a lot of you will be on today, there's a streamlined target validation route, which is just a little bit less onerous, just to try and make it accessible to SMEs. There's also a previous webinar on the SME Climate Hub by Enterprise Ireland. So do check that out, because that's another route. You can use the tools on that to kind of demonstrate net zero. As I said, power and maritime have a long-term target year of 2040 rather than 2050. And, these are minimum requirements. If you can bring it forward even earlier, that's even better. And power and flag sectors, that's forestry, land use and agriculture, must follow their sector-specific pathways. So they're kind of quite defined for them. Okay. That's the targets there. Fergal, how are we doing there on the chat? Do you want to jump in with anything, or will we move on to carbon removals and keep it to the end?
Yeah, we have a few questions, but I think probably best to keep going, and we'll leave them to the end.
Okay, well, look, I'm going to get you to do the next one, because, say we get our emissions right down, we still have residual emissions. This is where the carbon removals piece comes in. So it's kind of important to understand this, and I'll just let you explain this, Fergal.
Thanks, Raoul. So the next poll question, it's all about investing in carbon offset projects. So we have 3 project options, and we wanted to know, what project would you invest in? So the first one is Ugandan low smoke cook stoves, and they're priced at $8 per ton of CO2 equivalent offset. The second project is tree planting in Uganda from a project developer called COTAP, and they're priced at $15 per ton. And lastly, the Orca project in Iceland, which is direct air capture with carbon storage, otherwise known as DACS, and the price there is $1,300 per ton. So if you can, please select one. And again, please, have a guess in terms of, what you think is best for you, your organization, your objectives, and there's no wrong answer, and all answers are anonymous.
Okay, tree planting is kind of fairly popular there. I always think if you give 3 options, often people will pick the middle one. So in terms of price, but some going for the lowest cost, maybe about a quarter view, which is the Ugandan cook stoves. I'm surprised a lot of you going for direct air carbon and capture and storage, because that is very expensive. So you need to know your carbon footprint first. But you got to multiply your tons of CO2 equivalent by that value, and effectively that's what you would be spending in carbon credits for that particular technology at the moment. Hopefully that cost will come down. Okay, we got over 50 there. So tree planting being the most popular. We're going to move on to a little video about offsets. It's kind of a humorous one, and I think it paints an important concept about this, because some people kind of object to offsets, and I think even the Science-Based Targets Initiative have got themselves into a little bit of a trouble internally in terms of what is acceptable and what is not. So have a listen to this and see what you think of this.
Therefore, the mud stains were cleaned after the murder, meaning the murderer must be Lord Reginald.
Brilliant, Holmes! Bravo, but you failed to account for one thing. I purchased a murder offset. Oh, what? I went to London to find Jack the Ripper and paid him not to murder for a month. So you see, Mr. Holmes, on the whole, the world is in fact a little less murdery. That's the stupidest shit I ever heard!
Elementary, my dear Watson.
And thanks to the Climate Ad Project for that one. I think, it's a humorous take on it, but I guess it does highlight the potential pitfalls that companies face if they start investing in these projects and then claiming, carbon neutral, net zero, climate neutral, whatever they want. You have to be quite careful in your comms about this. I think the public are becoming increasingly aware of this, and it has backfired on some companies. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you is after the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting. So this is coming out of the University of Oxford. They've thought about a kind of project taxonomy, they call it, like trying to classify different types of carbon credits and whether they're good or not and whether they tick a box. And they've come up with 5 types of carbon credit projects, because there's so many of them out there. It's quite a confusing space in the voluntary market. And their document on this was only just revised in February, so I'm taking this from their latest document. You can see these first 3 types of carbon credits are about emissions avoidance or reduction. In my mind, that's kind of the same thing. We're avoiding additional emissions going up into the atmosphere. The first one is avoiding or reducing emissions from the geosphere without storage. So if we're avoiding, say, the burning of fossil fuels, and we could do that by renewable energy or energy efficiency projects. Fergal gave you an example of an energy efficient cook stove. So that would come under sort of the project type 1. The second one is avoided emissions from the biosphere. So if we're conserving rainforest and habitats and that sort of thing, that might stop additional emissions emanating to the atmosphere too. So avoiding ecosystem loss and degradation. And then the third type there is emissions reduction from the geosphere, but with storage. So you could have like a coal-fired power station, and if we're capturing the carbon coming out of the chimneys and injecting it into deep geological storage, well, at least we're locking away the carbon then. And there's pros and cons with that, I do understand, but that's where they classify that one. And if you're buying carbon credits, you may not want to be investing and supporting the coal industry, for example. So you need to think carefully about these projects if you do decide to invest in them. Now, the last two project types are about carbon removals, and these are important to today's discussion. So you can have carbon removal from the biosphere. So if we're planting trees and we're doing projects in Ireland with native species and that sort of stuff, you can have co-benefits in terms of biodiversity and all that. That's great. So tree planting will count there. I guess the challenge is what's to prevent that forest being burnt down, as the climate changes, or maybe there's storm damage or pest damage. And then the fifth type is carbon removal to the geosphere. So here we might have the likes of that direct air capture and carbon storage, and we're sucking it out of the air. But not only that, we're injecting it deep into a geological strata that is hopefully stable and locked away for thousands of years such that it can't come out. Now, these carbon removal offsets, my understanding is that they would count towards net zero, but there is an element of risk with them. And, this space is evolving quite quickly. So I'm kind of giving you the latest as I've seen it on it. And it might be that, we need these machines to suck emissions out of the atmosphere, and tree planting doesn't cut the mustard because maybe they're more riskier in terms of permanent removal from the atmosphere. Who can guarantee that their forest will be there in 100 years' time? So Oxford went a little bit further than that. They talked about having, if you're doing offsetting, that you have a net zero aligned offsetting portfolio. And in this chart, I just put the cursor on here. I think this is kind of interesting. A lot of us might be, investing in type 1 energy efficient cook stoves, maybe moving on to like protection of the rainforest. And then these carbon capture ones, they have a lower risk of reversal if we can put it into safe geological strata. But we should be moving towards carbon removal. So these blue ones in terms of our net zero claims. The problem with tree planting or maybe indeed biochar is that they might have a higher risk of reversal. Whereas if we can do deep geological storage, that's got the lowest risk of reversal. So what this graph is saying is that by the time we hit our long-term science-based targets by 2050 or sooner, if you're doing any of these carbon credits, they should all be, that type 5. This is 100% of those at that time. So here's a practical example of it. Microsoft have been seen to be a leader in this field for quite some time. And this graph shows that they've got their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, all the scopes in the gray bars, and they're going up over time. So they've been tracking that. They do have a plan to start reduction here. So quite an ambitious plan. And this is throughout their supply chain. So looking at any one involved in helping them with data centers and all the energy use. They have been investing in offsets on the negative axis here, but you can see the orange bars, which are avoided emissions offsets, they've transitioned away from that, and now they're only investing in carbon removal projects. And they've got a big plan here. They invested in 1.3 million tons of offsets in 2021, and they're planning on expanding that out to 2030, such that they hit what they're calling net zero by 2030. Now, you might say that's not a science-based target. They're only, well, it's a near-term target, isn't it? They're halving it by 2030, which would be acceptable, and then they're balancing that out. But hopefully this will have to keep on going down to 90% reduction and maybe less carbon removals. Now, there's a blog on that. Microsoft haven't found this journey easy. It's been very difficult, and it's quite an interesting read if you want to click on those links. So if you do want to buy offsets, here's some guidance. Emissions reduction simply comes first, but some companies do purchase them. That's why we've addressed them here. Carbon neutrality requires verified carbon offsets, and you can do that now. You can be carbon neutral tomorrow if you want to spend the money. But net zero requires verified carbon removal offsets, but only after your long-term LT target has been achieved. And you've got to achieve 90% plus emissions reductions. That's really the main message there by 2050 at the latest. You can use the International Carbon Reduction and Offsetting Alliance, or ICROA principles, or there are others which I'll give in a moment, but basically we want credits that are independently verified. They're unique, so they're not double claimed, double sold, or double issued. They must be real and measurable. And that's where the independent verification really comes in to check on that. They need to be permanent, and that can be challenging, particularly with tree planting and nature projects, and they need to be additional. If they're going to happen anyway, it's not really contributing to the overall goals that we have. Now, there's lots of other guidance there. So I mentioned the Oxford principles. I've got the link there for the ICROA Code of Best Practice, which was kind of the first thing out there. But we have two new initiatives. We've got the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which is more for carbon credit project developers. So there's the 10 core carbon principles, which will help you develop credible projects. And there's also the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, which is more on the buyer side. So they have like a claims code of practice, but it also assists countries that are looking into developing their own domestic voluntary carbon markets. So a lot going on in that space. I see we're coming up to time, Fergal, so I better get through this so we get to our questions. But just to give you some concluding thoughts, a lot of directives coming from the EU at us. So we've got the Green Claims Directive. Hopefully this will give us a bit of clarity on terms like carbon neutral versus net zero versus climate neutral. I've given you the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero as we see it. But you can see in the market that people will use these words interchangeably and often incorrectly. So net zero is more onerous, is really what we're driving at. This is a long-term journey, so don't expect to get it perfect the first time. We're not perfect as consultants. We aim to continuously improve our processes over time. But do start collating data now. Talk to your value chain that's looking upstream to your suppliers and downstream to your customers, okay? And a word of warning, with all of these target setting initiatives and reporting requirements, there is a danger of paralysis or inaction if we focus solely on reporting and creating targets. You don't need to be setting targets to be doing the right thing on climate action. And as a general guide, we recommend our clients spend no more than 15% of their time on reporting requirements, but dedicate 85% of your time to meaningful action that is really driving emissions reduction. We need to keep our eye on the ball with this. If you do want to get involved with net zero trajectories, well, you need to calculate your emissions to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or the ISO equivalent. You need to develop targets and publicly commit them through the SBTi or similar initiatives such as SME Climate Hub. And then if you're reducing emissions, I often give a sort of 5-step strategy for organizations. Focus on energy efficiency first. It's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. Decarbonize power supply then, so likes of solar PV on the roofs. Electrify everything where possible. We've got to get off fossil fuels. So if we can electrify our heating with heat pumps and our vehicles with EVs, that's going to go a long way. If you can't, think about alternative low and zero carbon fuels. And for some of you, carbon removals and storage may be a possibility. It depends on what your company does. Enterprise Ireland has the Green Transition Fund. There's never been so many supports to help you on this journey, so do take a look at that. And, you might have to report on progress annually. Are you subject to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive? If so, it may be a requirement on you. Now, we've tried to pack a lot into today's webinar, but if you want further reading, here's the link to the science-based net zero standard target. And just to be aware that they have validation fees, so it's $14,500 if you do a near-term science-based target plus a net zero target validation submission. That's the link to the ISO net zero guidelines, which we mentioned. Project Drawdown is a great read. They have a nice website, a lot of resources on the top 100 climate solutions to reverse global warming. I mentioned How Bad Are Bananas by Mike Berners-Lee. Effectively, it's the carbon footprint for everything. A very entertaining read. A new book here, which I've got by Chris Goodall, Ways to Net Zero. You could check out that. That was only published a month ago. And then the SME Climate Hub. We've got the link to the Enterprise Ireland webinar, which took place last September. So that's kind of ties in with the United Nations Race to Zero campaign. Well, we've covered a lot there. I'm going to thank you for your attention and just remind you we have the AEE Climate Action Certificate. We got that next week, but maybe more suitable for some of you, 15th to the 16th of October. It'll be held in Dublin. I think we're doing it in the Rediscovery Centre. Is that right, Fergal?
Yeah, in October at the
Yeah,
Rediscovery
great.
Centre in Ballymun.
Yeah. Got there, Kathleen. So how are we doing on the questions?
Thanks a million, Raoul. I mean, you really managed to cover a lot there. So you know, and look, we'll be sharing the slides afterwards. I'm just going to share my slides here again, and obviously sharing the recordings as well. So just looking at the few questions that come in, and some of the questions, I think, Raoul, you've actually answered them. You know, they came in earlier on around offsetting, but I think you've actually addressed them and answered them
Okay.
going through the different slides. One or two questions come in around, I suppose, the software and, you know, calculating carbon footprint. And I suppose I'd just like to plug then the government climate toolkit for business. So if you Google it, you'll be able to download the climate toolkit for business. So this is a really simple, free, you know, tool to use to calculate your business's carbon footprint. Now, it just gives you an estimate, but this is a really good starting point. And it also gives you an action plan and shows you where there's different supports available, whether it be from Enterprise Ireland, SAI, or other support options. So that's the climate toolkit for business. But yeah, you can, you know, other options then would be, you know, using Excel and calculating it that way. But Raoul, perhaps you'd like to add there in terms of the different options.
Yeah, so the good news about carbon footprinting is that the maths is really easy, right? So if you have a quantifiable activity and you know an emissions factor, you multiply the two together and you get a carbon footprint, right? So in concept, it's really easy. And that's why there's so many like software things coming up with tools online. You'll find plenty of them online. The trick is the assumptions, right? So you can spend a lot of money on software, but the assumptions will always be the limiting thing. So, you know, we developed our own tools and that sort of stuff, but that means we can affect the assumptions. And that's why we kind of actually don't use software for it. If the tools are kind of easy to answer, you tend to get a more rough estimate. So like we've got a simple carbon footprinting tool on our website, and it asks you things like, you know, how many bedrooms do you have? Do you eat a lot of meat and that sort of stuff? And it does an estimate based on that, those sort of qualitative questions. What we try and do is get the most robust data available for our clients. And often the challenge is gathering that data, maybe turning it around into something that's usable, because often the data is a bit messy, and then applying an appropriate emissions factor. And even finding that emissions factor, people sometimes get that wrong. Sometimes people make the mistake of you know, not dividing by 3 zeros to get their decimal points wrong. So you got to watch that as well. I guess that's what we specialize in. So yes, there are carbon tools out of there, but say like someone's asking about the family footprint, you know, it's just simple quantifiable activities multiplied by an emissions factor. Yes, you can do it in Excel. You're right there, Kathleen.
Yeah. And look, I suppose for businesses, scope 1 and 2 is fairly straightforward, and scope 3, as you kind of alluded to earlier on, is more difficult and more complex. So our webinar next week is on scope 3 emissions. So look, if anyone is interested in just calculating scope 3 emissions, I'd recommend you register for next week's webinar, and we'll hopefully learn more about calculating scope 3 emissions. I think that's it in terms of questions. If anyone else has, let me see, a few more are coming in now, actually. Very interested in sustainability, but learned about carbon offsets are not the answer for sustainable future. Yeah. So I think that's kind of it on the questions. It was mainly kind of around the offsetting and the software then that you know.
Yeah, I guess the software. So like you mentioned, the government's climate toolkit, like that's
Yeah.
the go-to place for today's discussion. The EPA also do have like, I think 3 tools that they've pulled out online, you know, for it. Very much geared towards domestic, you know, like I showed there. The challenge with domestic, you've got to be aware from it. The oil industry, or one particular company, was very successful at coining the term carbon footprint or promoting it. And effectively what they were doing back in 2004 were they were shifting the onus from the big companies onto the individuals. And now if you look around us, we've got a lot of people suffering from climate anxiety, climate guilt, and that's the negativity. So I know I showed my family carbon footprint, but the message has to be it's systematic economic change we need here. And that's why your sector, the enterprise sector, is so important to this, that we can work together without putting personal blame on individuals for not recycling the bean tin or whatever, which, it all helps, but it's not going to make a massive dent on our national emissions.
Yeah, no, look, absolutely. And thank you so much, Raoul and Fergal, for today. It was really informative webinar. And look, we'll be sharing as I said, the recording on our website as well. So look, before we finish off, I'd just like to flag again our webinar next week is on how to measure Scope 3 emissions. We will be running more webinars later on in the year on a range of sustainability topics. So look, if there's anything that you'd like to see covered, please do let us know, and we'll keep that in mind. So all the webinars, including the webinar in the SME Climate Hub, are available to watch on the Enterprise Ireland website. And this is a free resource for companies to commit to reducing their emissions. And your commitment will be on the SME Climate Hub website, and it'll also be on your own website, so it's transparent, but there was no actual verification, so that's why it's actually free. But it is another way of being transparent, I suppose, right, about your commitment. So that's the SME Climate Hub. And just for more information, I suppose, in terms of the range of supports that Enterprise Ireland have for client companies, check out our website, so the Enterprise Ireland website, and become more sustainable under the support section. So we have a range of supports, from training and consultancy supports to develop a metering roadmap, to develop a carbon reduction roadmap, to help you calculate your organization's carbon footprint or your product or service carbon footprint, to implementing an energy management system. Now, the supports can be used for a wide range of activities for improving the sustainability performance of companies, but just focusing today on decarbonisation. We've capital supports then for companies to install meters, to decarbonise their manufacturing processes and move away from fossil fuels. So to install technologies like heat pumps or install heat recovery. And then we have a range of RD&I supports to help companies develop more sustainable products, processes and services. So for more information, check out the website, contact your development advisor, or email ourselves, myself or Ankit, on green at enterprise-ireland.com. Or if you're a client of UDROS or IDA or the local enterprise office, reach out to your advisor there. So thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully you'll be able to join next week for our webinar on Scope 3 emissions. So thank you, Fergal and Raoul, again, and hope everyone has a nice afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Kathleen.